Part 1. After the Great Pyramids. History and Hieroglyphs. 1. The story up to now. A history in pyramids. After the Great Pyramid everything changed. The largest and most accurate stone block building ever made, it had been one of 4 similarly vast monuments that were erected in a 100-year period at the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. The first 2 of those gigantic structures were built during the lengthy reign of Sneferu III, the Great Pyramid with its extraordinary architectural refinement, and the reign of Khufu, his successor, the last, and the Great Pyramid's majestic partner on the Cairo skyline, for Khafra, probably one of Khufu's grandsons, who had ruled the region of the Lower Nile from about 2540 BC. Apart from several other enormous building projects that were undertaken in the same span of time, those 4 great funerary monuments alone had consumed more than 17 million tons of limestone. That is to say, for their completion within that single century, around 240 building blocks, each one weighing 2.5 tons, would have had to have been set into their positions on one of those 4 Great Pyramids in the course of each and every working day. Those 4 colossal monuments are the iconic products of the world's first known state, a Bronze Age kingdom which had consisted of a royal residence with satellites and suppliers and myriad farming settlements, set all along the floodplain of the Lower Nile, with a combined population, so best estimates would currently suggest, of around a million people. The logistics of provisioning the construction of those pyramids, a statewide system of supply which had transported enormous tonnages of stone and copper, food and timber all up and down the great wide river, would have required the active participation of a large part of the population and put a strain upon the rest. When it was over, the enterprise had transformed the culture of the pharaonic state, giving it a unique self-confidence, a powerful and mature identity. After those 4 great pyramids, a 300-year-long line of smaller royal pyramids was set along the ending of the river's valley, one following the other. Together, they span the area that is now known as the Old Kingdom. Each of these later pyramids was built for a different king, and all of them were set within a 15-mile line stretching southwards from the latitude of modern Cairo down along the high western horizon of the Nile Valley into the sandy desert cemeteries of Saqqara, with their dimensions standardized at around 1/3 of the Great Pyramid's enormous bulk, and with their exterior angles and their internal architecture derived from those of the older and much larger pyramids. These later monuments are relatively similar. So Western histories, which are based on narratives of incident and progress, might well conclude that after the construction of those earlier, grander and more innovative monuments, ancient Egypt's history had slowed. What, in reality, had happened was that the focus of the pharaonic court had shifted. After the 4 great pyramids, and for the first time in the history of pharaonic culture, all those earlier enterprises were reassessed. The courtly offices and the organizations responsible for their construction classified, developed and described in a mass of text and images. The age of continuous cultural innovation had passed forever. From now on, that would no longer be the pharaonic way. Over the following 2 millennia, pharaonic history would take the form of a series of successive periods of dissolution, stasis and renewal, accompanied by bouts of deliberation and elaboration, both literary and visual, on life and death within the state that the Great Pyramid makers had constructed, along with a few remarkable adventures that would shake the court from top to bottom. The story of those reflections and renaissances comprises a most exotic history, one quite foreign to the modern world. 2. Writing changes everything. After 2540 BC, from about the same time that the court masons had started to build royal pyramids far smaller than before, the chapels of the courtiers' tombs, which previously had been little more than decorated corridors set into rectangles of stone, were expanded and Embellished, a metamorphosis of architecture and decoration that grew till it comprised a series of impressive rooms. Several of these celebrated monuments, the tomb chapels of Meruka and Tahotep, for example, their shadowed walls covered with scenes of so-called daily life are now icons of pharaonic culture and firm fixtures on the tourist trail. Freestanding sculptures were also placed within these sumptuous chapels, many of considerable quality, and monumental written texts, which previously had been but sparely used, became a commonplace. Text describing the activities pictured in the reliefs covering the tomb chapel's walls, text outlining schemes of offerings for the dead and describing lands and titles held or granted by the king, text telling of a tomb's commissioning or recording an encounter or a correspondence with Pharaoh. About halfway through those considerable processes of change, at around 2380 BC, the interior passages and chambers of the royal pyramids, which previously had not had a single image drawn upon their walls, were also engraved with hieroglyphic texts, a practice that continued down to the Old Kingdom's ending. These are the so-called pyramid texts, and they are the oldest known body of text to have survived from ancient Egypt. Of themselves, the hieroglyphs that were engraved within the tomb chapels and pyramids were neither rare nor innovatory, having been employed for a wide variety of tasks for many centuries. Yet the hieroglyphs engraved within the pyramids were employed in a different manner from anything that had gone before, when for the most part those same signs had been used to record names and titles and simple lists of goods, if such a usage may be considered to have had a grammar. It was a grammar like that held by labeled goods upon a supermarket shelf, that is, the signs and words had mainly served as elements of identification and numeration and a system of stocking and supply which, in the case of pharaonic Egypt, had provisioned the families and dependents of the kings and the officials of the royal court. Seldom had such usage required the composition of whole sentences, and only very seldom had one sentence followed another. By the midpoint of the 3rd millennium BC, however, in that turning world as the size of the royal pyramids diminished, the use of hieroglyphic was extended so that it could hold a self-contained writing system with a grammar that seems to have reproduced some elements of spoken language, though a few surviving earlier texts anticipate this remarkable development. Traditional historians have long regarded this sudden eruption of words and writing within the monuments of the later Old Kingdom as the time when the curtains of the prehistoric past had parted to reveal the living world of ancient Egypt. The contemporary scribes and courtiers, upon the other hand, had not. They considered the previous and now largely silent era when the 4 colossal pyramids had been built as the age in which their courtly culture gained maturity. And so in later ages, prayers were composed as Neferu that addressed him as a god, and building blocks from the temples that had stood beside the 4 great pyramids were placed like seeds inside the bulk of smaller later pyramids. Texts too, that were considered to have been composed in that epic age were regarded with a kind of awe. Ruefully addressing a blank sheet of papyrus, a tongue-tied scribe of later times writes that he hopes to find different words from those used by his ancestors, whilst a passage in another text tells how a king ordered some old scrolls to be spread out before him so that he could see how things should be done in a proper manner. Even the so-called instruction text compilations of saws and etiquette, which lists some of the manners of Old Kingdom court society in excruciating detail, defer to the near-silent age of the colossal pyramids, the age, so it has recently been suggested, that had been anciently identified as the epitome of the pharaonic state within a century or so of its conclusion. Given the prestige of the early pyramid-building kings, it is hardly surprising that the first lines of one of those instruction texts identifies its author as a prince named Hardjedef, a man whom other texts describe as a son of the pharaoh Khufu, for whom the Great Pyramid of Giza had been built. In somewhat similar fashion, A passage from a Book of the Dead dash. From text written to accompany the dead 1,000 years and more. After King Khufu's time, describes Prince Hardjedef as having rediscovered the text of a funerary rite that had previously been a great secret, unseen and unperceived. Such assertions need not be taken at face value. Before the age of printing and modern notions of authorship and copyright, literary attributions had different purposes and meanings from those that we assume today. In claiming ancient authorship, the authors of those latter texts, whose literary styles alone show that they were writing many centuries after Khufu's time, may simply have been providing the words they were about to write with the gravitas of deep antiquity. Yet once there really was a prince of Khufu's time named Hardjedef. His tomb still stands upon the Giza plateau in the evening shadow of that pharaoh's pyramid. And as a few rare graffiti of the work gang named Khufu is drunk that are painted on some of its building blocks attest, the prince's massive stone block tomb had been built by some of that king's pyramid makers. In the manner of his times, Prince Hardjedef was interred underneath the center of his tomb in a granite sarcophagus which had been lowered down a deep vertical shaft and set into a tiny rock-hewn chamber at the bottom. The body, so as excavators found in 1925, was intact and in position. Head east, lying on left side, contracted, hands straight out in front of pelvis. Tall old man. Backbone intact but carefully severed. Between 8th and 9th vertebra, skull had toppled over from neck and lay almost in position near south wall opposite the door. Hardjedef's tomb is but one of some 200 similarly enormous monuments, the so-called Giza mastabas, which in Khufu's day had been set across that windy plateau and sullen sandy grids. Many other members of the royal household were interred within those same vast cemeteries and in the same manner as Prince Hardjedef, yet most of them today are little more than the names that are inscribed upon their monuments. That single prince alone seems to have gained an aura of celebrity, and that within a century or so of his interment. For when the archaeologists were clearing drifted sand from the area around his tomb, they came across the inscribed remnants of several modest monuments set up in later ages. And one of those memorials, after asking passers-by to recite a prayer so that a courtier named Ka could receive more offerings at his tomb, continues by describing Ka as one who adores Hardjedef. Writing had changed everything. A single prince who present records seemed to show had lived and died in a pre-literary age had been transformed into an ageless literary personality. Nor was the potential of this newfound lease of life, this extra presence amongst the living, which previously would have depended on the continuous ration of offerings placed within his tomb chapel, lost on succeeding generations. For in the following millennium court scribes would proudly claim that, rather than colossal tombs, written words were by far the best memorials. Prince Hardjedef makes several more appearances in later texts, most famously in the elegant calligraphic script of a papyrus, known now as the Papyrus Westcar, and written some 5 centuries after the prince's lifetime, that tells a series of tales which are all set in the fabled courts of the great pyramid-building kings. These literary courts are a far cry from the hard reality, the dust and haste that must have filled the offices of the overseers of the construction of the 4 great pyramids. These texts describe tranquil, even hedonistic, palaces, where furniture is made of gold and ebony, where boatloads of scantily clad virgins are said to row across the lake to tickle the royal fancy, and Prince Hardjedef plies the Nile upon a royal barge to bring soothsayers such as the learned Jedi to entertain the king. And after Jedi had performed prodigious acts of magic for his majesty and looked deep into his kingdom's future, Khufu commanded that he was to be sent to the house of the king's son, Hardjedef, that he may dwell there with him, where his rations should be fixed at 1,000 loaves of bread, 100 jugs of beer, an ox, and 100 bundles of vegetables. And they did all that his majesty had commanded. Such stories are not as straightforward as they might first appear. Just as it has been observed of Flaubert's Egyptian diaries that rather than simply recording a visit to 19th century Egypt, they are also an elaboration of the accounts of earlier European travelers to the Orient. So, too, the texts that mention Hardjedef were part of a pharaonic literary tradition. And more than that. For just as Hardjedef, a prince of Khufu's court, lived on an ancient literary memory, so today his name appears in histories of ancient Egypt where, for the lack of any other information, the simple tales of the papyrus Westcar are taken as a prime source of the history of the period. Hardly a single modern history book, indeed, describes the historical changes that followed the building of the four colossal pyramids without reference to the tales of the papyrus Westcar. So this slimmest of novellas, written in a different age, has become a part of ancient Egypt's modern history, part of the history of that vital period in which the largest and most complex structures the ancient world would ever make were being erected, in the fundamental structures of pharaonic culture were in the process of their definition. So whilst Hardjedef the man is represented only by his bones and by a tomb upon the Giza plateau that bears his name, Hardjedef the literary prince appears in both ancient Egyptian literature and also in modern histories as a great sage, as the pious author of religious texts, and as a character in tales fit for the Brothers Grimm, in which it is assumed genuine dynastic politics are described, and every fresh found occurrence of that prince's name, each newfound hieroglyphic epithet, adds weight and substance to this literary figure, whilst that enormous tomb upon the Giza plateau underlines the fact that this complex, composite, largely literary figure is based, somehow, on cold hard fact. To that extent, Prince Hardjedef is a perfect metaphor for modern histories of pharaonic culture, just as the Old Testament, with its descriptions of camels and coinage, of slavery and international warfare, invests its descriptions of Bronze Age Palestine with the ills and angst of Hellenistic Alexandria, where it was compiled and edited, just as Shakespeare's kings are viewed through the politics and preoccupations of his own times, so too our modern histories of ancient Egypt are filled with sentiments and narratives of later times and other cultures. And by far the largest of these influences are from the ages in which Egyptology itself was born, which, as with Flaubert's diaries, was 19th century Europe. In large part this unusual situation is a product of the lack of any other information to contradict such parochial histories. None of the texts that have survived from ancient Egypt are written histories. All which has survived from that colossal wreck is a myriad of names, epithets and titles, letters, dockets and accounts, and some tracts concerning ritual and the afterlife. That, and a few royal records and decrees, and some fragments such as the papyrus Westcar, form a so-called literary corpus that is so ill-preserved that its remnants are presently contained in one stout paperback. Nor is there reason to imagine that an ancient Gibbon or Macaulay lies buried in the sand. Neither, in the event that such unlikely treasures were to be uncovered, could it be assumed that they had performed the same roles in their society as do histories today. Unlike ancient Greece and Rome or, indeed, the modern world, the histories, theologies and legal codes of the pharaonic kingdom were not laid out in written words. It was not that kind of culture. It inhabited a different time, a different space. And at its ending, a wise Egyptian living in Hellenistic Alexandria had understood that difference, warning that the ostentatious chatter of the Greeks, whose philosophy, he says, is but an empty noise of argument, would threaten the very core of the venerable pharaonic culture which uses no arguments. And if that should happen, the melancholy sage continues, then the ancient and most holy valley of the Nile, this copy of heaven, the abode of shrines and temples, will be most full of graves and of dead men. That canny Alexandrian describes a dilemma faced by the historians of all cultures in which literature was not the main means of expression. To some extent, It is the same problem that is faced today by visitors to exhibitions of old master paintings. Like ancient Egypt, those venerable Western images have long been the focus of an academic industry whose primary means of expression is the written word. And though it is difficult to precisely detail the effects of that continuing blizzard of written information, the pictures' titles, their identification and their various explanations, the writings of historians and theologians, of Vasari, Shelley and Madame Sesostris, it inevitably alters our appreciation of those silent images. For, in the modern world, writing changes everything. What hope, therefore, that traditional histories of ancient Egypt, which are largely based on translations of randomly surviving fragments of non-historical texts, can begin to encompass the true history of such a vastly visual culture as that of pharaonic Egypt? Nonetheless, the powerful drug of 2 centuries of academic research has persuaded a large part of the modern world that the yawning gap between the modern world and the most ancient of all kingdoms has been securely bridged. Yet as you stand today amidst the graceful relics of the ancient culture of the Lower Nile, in a tomb or temple or even a museum, a sense of dislocation hangs all around, like incense in the air. In earlier times the mystery of another world that seems just out of reach was explained with the aid of alchemical texts and Gnostic tracts. Today, the popular media pretends that scientific breakthroughs will serve for its elucidation. In reality, after 2 centuries of study and excavation, the non-stop flood of written data has simply heightened that age-old sense of separation. This is the mystery of ancient Egypt. This is what keeps us peering into Tutankhamun's inlaid eyes, wondering what had lain behind them. As the eminent Egyptologist James Allen recently observed, we are like paleontologists, able to assemble impressive reconstructions of long-dead species, but still with only a vague notion of what they looked like in the flesh. 3. Reviving Hardjedef? Ironically enough, only the first half of the ancient culture of the Lower Nile, its pre-literary phase, holds the narratives of a truly modern history within it, for its relics contain clear evidence of material and political development. The second more familiar half of Egypt's ancient history, alternatively, the age of written text, shows no evidence of such developments. In strictly material terms, indeed, the literary pharaonic state may be said to have been a period of overall decline. Yet in that second phase a marvelous architecture was developed, the pharaohs. When adventuring, Hardjedef, some bones in a sarcophagus, obtained a literary afterlife, and almost every element of that courtly culture was elaborated and refined. Such opulent millennia, therefore, must surely hold great histories of their own. That at least is the belief which has inspired a 200-year-old academic industry to continue to scrutinize the writings that survive and generate the papers, catalogs and theses that are the raw materials of traditional historians. Naturally, such text-based histories may only be revised or enlarged by the reconsideration of previously studied texts or by the incorporation of newfound documents into the previously established body of information, a process that has become an ongoing international academic project that, with its specializations and its particular vocabularies, provides the impression of a scientific progress, the illusion of the unfolding excellence of fact. There are 3 fundamental flaws in this approach. Firstly, the overwhelming emphasis on literary-based evidence has served to cut the seamless history of pharaonic culture into 2 separate halves, pre-literary and literary. Secondly, as writing of itself was an activity restricted to relatively small circles of people inside the pharaonic state, ancient Egyptian history changes from that of a history of an entire population in its pre-literary phases to that of the history of the careers of some individual courtiers and hardly ever of the court they served. Here, however, the surviving texts sometimes provide fragments of a history that hold Within them the vividness of living language, real events. The third objection to this approach is that the spare data that the surviving texts supply are entirely insufficient to support most of the narratives of modern histories. Just one papyrus, for example, the so-called Papyrus Westcar, records the tale of Hardjedef at Khufu's court. No one knows its origin. It lacks both a beginning and an end, and there is no certainty as to the date of its composition. Yet, for want of any other information, historians frequently employ that story and others in that same papyrus as prime sources for the history of the period known nowadays as the Old Kingdom. Traditional histories of the Old Kingdom, indeed, are especially slight, because, unlike the massive extraordinary visual evidence from those times, the surviving written data is extremely scanty and the era of itself is very long. Before the 1840s, European historians had hardly noticed it at all, and the four colossal pyramids were portrayed as the products of a primitive and savage age of unfathomable antiquity. In 1879, in Professor Baruch's Great History of the Pharaohs, the Old Kingdom's 400 years still only occupied 20 pages in comparison with the 450 that describe the later periods. And in 1961, in the similarly sized history of Sir Alan Gardner, arguably the greatest Egyptologist to have worked in the English language, the history of the Old Kingdom only occupies twice that amount. So slight, indeed, is surviving written information from all periods of pharaonic history that it can only serve as the solid basis for an outline of a text-based political history for a few centuries during the second millennium BC. Thus traditional histories of ancient Egypt have to be glued together from an incredible mishmash of materials, from tales like those in Papyrus Westcar, from calendar dates written on loaves of bread and jars of wine, from speculations based on everything from reconstructed family quarrels, the political use of magic, and the operation of the Roman Damnatio Memoriae, and from those rare contemporary texts that record single, usually unrelated, incidents. This fundamental lack of data makes it impossible to construct a conventional history of pharaonic culture without the broad assumption that, allowing for some environmental differences, life in the ancient courtly culture of the Lower Nile had been similar to life within the states of early modern European courts. Only then can traditional historical narratives be constructed. The common illusion that the ways and means of European courtly culture were also operating in the ancient culture of the Lower Nile is greatly aided by the terms usually employed to describe the inhabitants of Pharaoh's court. Simple English words like dynasty and kings, palaces and fortresses, queens, priests and generals, along with myriad other translated epithets and titles, encourage would-be historians to lapse into the narratives of 19th century European Romanticism. So it is hardly surprising that traditional histories of ancient Egypt tell bourgeois tales of kings and princes, of harems and fine artists, of noble courtiers, great generals with mighty armies guarding a nation-state, of nuclear families, with customs posts and a quasi-cash economy. At first glance, this twilight world seems able to account for almost everything in Pharaohland, whilst any awkward discrepancies are explained away as evidence of residual savagery or nascent Orientalism. What in reality this weird scenario has produced is a mid-Victorian ancient Egypt filled up with the prejudices, racial, ethnic and social, of that era. An ancient Egypt in which pharaohs live in sensible domesticity, undertake imperial diplomacy through the usual channels, whose soldiers are adept at bivouac and maneuver, whose priests are envious and jealous, whose scholars scribes are industrious and profound, and whose laborers in the usual way are loyal, comical and devious. And all the while the beauteous mass of ancient things which the craftsmen of the pharaonic culture made with such an extraordinary care flap like butterflies at the window of the seminar room, unnoticed and abandoned. The supreme irony in this is that though written texts were never at the heart of pharaonic culture, those that have survived have played a major role in the construction of modern ancient Egypt. Such a fundamental role, in fact, that ever since Jean-François Champollion deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs in the early 19th century, the study and translation of pharaonic texts has continuously distorted a broader understanding of that ancient culture. This is not to pretend that hieroglyphic texts have no place in historiography of pharaonic culture, nor, certainly, that the thin corpus of historical fact derived from pharaonic texts which underpins our modern ancient Egypt should be abandoned. Over the past 2 centuries, the advances that followed Champollion's decipherment have brought us to a brand new understanding of that lost and distant past, one that the modern world, if not Egypt's ancient scribes, can readily comprehend. A reliable chronology, an essential element of any modern history, has been established. Most known texts have been analyzed, translated and shrewdly judged. So along with the vocabulary of prince, priest, pyramid, and the rest, which has become the language of this past description, the information held in that research now frames all modern orderings and explanations of the ancient culture of the Lower Nile. This, then, is the stage on which all new histories of this ancient Egypt are acted out, and it was made in Europe in 2 separate stages. The first of these, when Egyptian hieroglyphs were deciphered, when the fundamental vocabulary that yet describes the offices of pharaohs kingdom was laid down in the broad chronology of the later literate phases of pharaonic culture was established, took place in the decades that followed the French Revolution and reflects the spirit of that age. The second stage, when that earlier vision of pharaonic culture was brought to its first maturity, when what had been made readable by the decipherment of hieroglyphs was understood, took place in German universities in the decades before the First World War. This was the age in which Egyptology's traditional vocabulary was endorsed in the name of science, when the structures of hieroglyphic grammar were set within the framework of classical philology and a standard hieroglyphic dictionary was compiled, and those researches are filled with the spirit, the disturbing rhetoric, of those times, and those narratives and attitudes, their sense of social order and of time and place, are an integral part of modern ancient Egypt. To make new histories of old Egypt, therefore, both elements of this strange confection, both the relics of old Egypt and their interpretation, throughout the last 2 centuries, must be brought into play. Part 2, Making Ancient Egypt. Champollion and his successors form the beginning. Mise and Scène. A great number of books and articles have been written describing the decipherment of pharaonic hieroglyphs by Jean-François Champollion in the early 1820s, and most of them are concerned with arguments of academic precedence. Was it a Briton or a Dane, a Frenchman or a Swede who had first understood how hieroglyphs should be read? They missed the point. By the 1820s, the decipherment of ancient Eastern scripts had become a polymath parlor game for European scholars, and one that eventually resulted in what an Assyriologist has called a cascade of decipherment. Amongst all of the would-be decipherers of hieroglyphic, however, Champollion alone had a lifelong commitment to the study of pharaonic culture, such dedication that even his enemies had dubbed him l'Egyptian. So after he had solved a great part of the scholarly riddle of the hieroglyphs, a process in which he was aided, doubtless, by the observations of several of his contemporaries, Champollion devoted the remainder of his life to ordering, cataloging and explaining the relics of pharaonic Egypt. And the methods and terminologies that he and his immediate successors developed remain the bedrock of the study of that culture down till today. First news of Champollion's decipherment had stirred considerable excitement amongst fellow scholars, many of whom were occupied in the exploration of the roots of language and of European nationhood. Further readings of his later papers, however, which appeared throughout the 1820s and were concerned with the order and history of pharaonic society, had seemed to strip the magic from a fabled kingdom that the West had considered to be a fount of wisdom and enlightenment since classical times. Born of the Bible and the literature of ancient Greece and Rome, the antique vision of pharaonic Egypt had been spectacularly reviving in Champollion's own lifetime, cultivated by a variety of nationalists, revolutionaries and Freemasons, from Mozart's librettists to Dr. Guillotin and General Lafayette. So in August 1793, in a commemoration of the storming of the Bastille, a giant statue of the Egyptian goddess Isis flanked by two sitting lions, a token of the power of enlightened nature and an antidote to Christianity, was placed upon its fallen stones as part of a Fontaine de la Régénération. And 5 years later, Napoleon's battalions had invaded Egypt attended by a regiment of scholars, many of whom were set to measure that country's ancient monuments, to make copies of their decorations and plans of their architecture and publish the results of those investigations in a series of enormous folios. Just as Napoleon's scholars had culled the classic arts of Rome for exhibition at the Louvre, so now the antique wisdom of the East would be gathered up, in books, in France. Later generations have usually portrayed Napoleon's grand tour of Egypt as a heroic enterprise. Facing war, hunger and Mamluk guerrillas, sketching, on occasion, with musket balls pounded to a pencil point, the visible remains of the mysterious kingdom that ancient sages had described as the temple of the world had intoxicated Napoleon's scholar savants. Chief amongst those mysteries, both for the French savants and for the ancient Greeks and Romans who in a similar quest for ageless wisdom had interviewed Egyptian temple priests, were the ancient hieroglyphs, the sacred signs that were engraved upon the tombs and temples, on statues and stone stele, and briskly inked on everything from shrouds and coffins to rolls of brown papyrus. After Napoleon's adventure in the East, therefore, a variety of Europeans had dabbled in decipherment. Champollion published the first paper describing his decipherment of hieroglyphs, the Lettre à Dacier, in Paris, at the age of 32 and just 2 decades after Napoleon's Egyptian escapade. A linguistic prodigy, Champollion had taught at the University of Grenoble from the age of 19. Even as a boy, people had recognized his extraordinary abilities. Joseph Fourier, the renowned mathematician who had accompanied Napoleon to Egypt and had shown the child, the younger brother of his secretary, some of the savant's drawings, remarked that the precocious youth was a voracious chicken demanding triple rations. Brave Fourier had stayed with the French occupation forces in Egypt until their expulsion in August 1801 at the hands of a British expeditionary force. As secretary to the assassinated General Kleber, who had commanded the French army after Napoleon's brisk departure, he had compiled an inventory of the antiquities that the defeated French had handed to the British, a list which had included, as item number 8, the celebrated bilingual stela known as the Rosetta Stone, whose text had already aided the would-be decipherers of hieroglyphs. After the return, Napoleon had appointed Fourier as governor of the newly formed department of Isère in southeastern France, with its administrative center at Grenoble. At the same time, the mathematician was also a leading member of a government committee charged to publish the savant's work in the volumes of the Napoleonic Description de l'Egypte, for which he would compose a powerful introduction. With a number of his fellow adventurers in Egypt, this committee controlled not only the contents of the description but also the continued study of ancient Egypt within France. The savants did not take kindly to Champollion's Lettre. Brief, simply written, and followed in good order by the lengthier and heavily illustrated Précis du Système Hieroglyphique, it showed that most of the signs that they had laboriously copied in Egypt and which, in common with most other scholars of the day, they had imagined to have been philosophical symbols, actually represented the sounds and words of an ancient language that was echoed in dialects of Coptic, the language of medieval Egyptian Christians. Nor had Champollion's further observation that the ancient kingdom would only be known through the interpretation of the hieroglyphs pleased them either, for they had long believed on the basis of a few bilingual inscriptions that the surviving writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans were sufficient to supply such mundane information. The savants, on the other hand, were after larger things, nothing less. In that electrifying age when feudalism was swept away and modern Europe was in the processes of invention, then the foundations for a brand new philosophic history for that brave new world. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that Edme François Jomard, the savant secretary of the Napoleonic Publishing Committee, dubbed Champollion's descriptions of some religious texts as the superfluous records of long-dead superstition. Jomard, after all, had excavated the baselines of the Great Pyramid at Giza and discovered to his satisfaction that its measurements held, in absolute perfection, all the known units of measurement which man had ever used around the world. In other words, the pyramid was that enlightenment delight, a universal measure. In similar fashion and along with most other savants, Jomard also gave great credence to a theory promulgated by the Parisian scientist and anti-clerical revolutionary Charles-François Dupuy, who maintained that all religions, ancient and modern, had their origins in the circuits of the heavenly bodies which had first been observed and mapped in ancient Egypt, and whose movements along with their supposed accompanying influences upon life on earth had been plotted and described by ancient priests and set into the 12 signs of the zodiac, chiming both with Freemasonry and popular anti-clericalism, depuis book origine de tout. Les cultes, ou la religion universelle, the origin of all religions, had been a sensation when it had first appeared in 1781, a sensation eerily repeated a century later in the underlying narratives of Fraser's Golden Vow, which also enjoyed a considerable longevity. The wisest and oldest priests of Egypt, Dupuy had observed, believed with plenty, that the only gods were the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars composing the zodiac. Dupuy, so his translator wrote, had planted the torchlight of reason and history into the midst of the dome of St. Peter. To their great delight, Napoleon's savants had discovered that the ancient Egyptians had placed large and splendid zodiacs and star charts in several of their tombs and temples, even while he was still in Egypt. Fourier had realized that, if Dupuy's theory was true, modern astronomic calculations based upon those ancient star charts could enable the year that they were made to be fixed in modern time. Given that the ancient Egyptian calendar appeared to have existed unchanged till the arrival of the Romans, the ancient star charts offered the further possibility of constructing an accurate concordance, a day-by-day connection, between the modern calendar and that of Pharaoh's Egypt. So the savants had made careful copies of the several zodiacs and star charts that they had found within the tombs and temples, a labor that they believed would not only serve to prove Dupuy's theories on religion, but also to enable human history to penetrate a previously unfathomable past. So far, Fourier had excitedly written to a friend on the day of his arrival back in France. By the time that Champollion's Lettre et Dacier had appeared in print, Fourier along with several other of the savants had already published elaborate commentaries on ancient Egyptian astronomy and zodiacs for the description to Egypt, and was working on 3 further papers on the subject in an elaborate chronology of pharaonic Egyptian history based on the same material. Jomard meanwhile, and at huge expense, had persuaded the French government to purchase from Muhammad Ali Pasha, Egypt's ruler, the 2 massive roofing blocks of the celebrated Temple of Dendera in Upper Egypt, whose decoration held one of the finest of Egyptian zodiacs. 2 heroic engineers had brought the Dendera zodiac to France, where it was displayed within the Louvre, and thousands queued for hours to see it. To many of those visitors, the reliefs offered hard and public proof of Dupuy's theories, which claimed that the zodiac was 3 times as old as Moses. So the zodiac became a major topic of the Parisian salons, whilst at that same time Dupuy publishers were working with Jomard on a second edition of the description, and Jomard was anticipating a promotion to the post of curator of the museums of the Louvre. Unfortunately for all that, the first signs that Champollion and several other would-be decipherers had successfully translated were some of the little groups of hieroglyphs which were a common feature of pharaonic inscriptions and were enclosed within so-called rings or cartouches. The latter term, apparently, deriving military fashion from similarly shaped munitions used by the French army in Egypt. Just as several would-be decipherers had previously guessed, these cartouches usually held groups of phonetic hieroglyphs spelling out the names of kings and queens, working from a drawing made by one of Napoleon's savants. When the Dendera zodiac was still in situ, Champollion had deciphered the contents of a cartouche from an inscription which framed the circle of the zodiac, which he transliterated as the word autocrator, or emperor, a classical term of Hellenistic and Roman times, underlining that most awkward of translations, other hieroglyphs in the savants' drawings of the temple's decorations next to the zodiac proved to spell out the names of several Roman emperors whose images were also depicted as pharaohs in the temple's other decorations. None of those scenes, therefore, nor the temple itself, was anything like as old as Moses, a fact that Champollion gleefully announced to an assembly of the Parisian Academy of Science. Bigger souls like Fourier soon saw the light, bore Champollion no grudge and went on to more rewarding things. Many, though, including Jomard and several other Parisians, did not. Not only had the decipherment rendered null and void decades of their researches, but it had also challenged their fundamental view of ancient Egypt. Hence the grand reaction. Some of the savants now argued that the hieroglyphs were of little consequence, merely a late adaptation of the Greek and Latin alphabets, and that Champollion's decipherment was of but small importance. Had not the celebrated Lettre and Dacier, they argued, the very paper whose publication had announced the decipherment of hieroglyphs, only managed to translate the names of Roman and Hellenistic pharaohs which, as Champollion himself had noted, were but clumsy hieroglyphic transcriptions of Greek and Latin names, was not the celebrated Rosetta Stone, which held the same text both in Greek and hieroglyphic, composed in Hellenistic times. So began a series of lengthy arguments concerning zodiacs and hieroglyphs that were joined by some of the other would-be decipherers who squabbled about Champollion's role in the decipherment, an argument in which bad-tempered nationalisms often played a part. Possessive of native wit and clear-sighted confidence, Champollion could easily rebuff his enemies. Yet Napoleon's savants controlled the study of ancient Egypt and France, whereas Champollion, a man of modest means, had already lost his post at the University of Grenoble as a result of his political activities. Despite his many supporters and admirers, there was little hope of him securing government patronage in Paris to continue his researches. From that time on, he later said, his homeland would be ancient Egypt. This, then, is the background against which hieroglyphs had been deciphered, the age in which national wealth in Europe had increased beyond all previous imaginings, and patriots were transforming from drive Johnson's definition as fractious disturbers of governments to the gallant soldiers of the world's first national armies. Champollion had been 3 years old when Louis XVI was guillotined, 1501. Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. Throughout his life, there were continuing dialogues, sometimes lethal dialogues, concerning such novel abstractions as society and economics, race and national culture, as George Steiner describes. All of this at the same time that the most ancient of all earthly kingdoms was being mapped, translated and catalogued for the first time in modern history. 5. The road to Memphis. Champollion and Turin. As is well known, Napoleon's expedition to Egypt precipitated a Europe-wide epidemic of Egyptomania and, consequently, the pillaging of that country's ancient monuments by a ragtag mix of crooks and consuls, soldiers and adventurers. Even as Champollion worked on the decipherment, boats stuffed with crates of antiquities were already sailing from Alexandria to the ports of Europe, where there was a steadily growing market for such things. The first and finest of these cargoes had been gathered by one Bernardino Drovetti, who had served with Napoleon in Egypt and who originally offered his collection to France. Stung by the debacle of the Dendera Zodiac, however, for which they had paid a fortune, the Parisian government had refused to buy Drovetti's antiquities, and they were purchased by His Royal Highness Charles Felix, King of Sardinia, and Duke of Savoy, who planned to exhibit his brand new treasures in a Baroque palace in Turin. Even as the negotiations for the purchase of Drovetti's 3,000-odd antiquities were being finalized, ministers of the Turin court were arranging for Champollion, the only man in all the world with a command of hieroglyphs, to catalogue the vast collection, which was being hauled in crates on ox-drawn carriages from the port of Genoa through the Ligurian Alps to Charles Felix's capital. So on June 7, 1824, Champollion also crossed the Alps to Italy, where he spent the best part of the next 2 years. The road to Memphis, he later wrote, passes through Turin. And that was true. For that city had become the proud possessor of the first museum of Egyptian antiquities in the world, and 2. This state's collections are among the finest of them all. So there it was, under Champollion's scrutiny, that the methods of modern Egyptology were born. Unlike other decipherers of those times, he was interested in far more than linguistics. Since childhood, indeed. When Champollion had first seen the savant's drawings, he had been obsessed with ancient Egypt. By his early 20s and a decade before the Lettre and Dacier, he had already published 3 volumes on the geography and history of the ancient kingdom, culled from nuggets of information from ancient Greek and Roman sources in the works and recollections of more modern travelers, with many of whom he had directly corresponded. This then was the considerable data bank on which he could always draw, an extensive source of written information for such central Egyptological subjects as astronomy and mummification, which still frames all modern understanding of such things. At Turin, as he catalogued and ordered the grand collection of antiquities for a European king, Champollion was building on that ancient fund of knowledge, enlarging the classical and traditional vision of ancient Egypt, its history and its religious and social life. That Champollion chose to catalogue a collection of portable antiquities rather than to sail straight to the land of his childhood dreams underlines the care with which he set about establishing the ancient Egypt he was in the process of creating. At the same time, however, it warns us that the ancient Egypt which Champollion was busily constructing was made in Europe, amongst the royal collections of the world's first museum of pharaonic treasures, and was laid out in the manner of a traditional European sculpture gallery. A point of view. The first thing that had struck Champollion on his arrival at Turin was the beauty of Egyptian sculpture. Its excellence, he wrote to his brother, bears comparison to the classical arts, a subject that had found its own Champollion some 50 years before in the figure of Johann Joachim Winckelmann. And as he said about ordering Egyptian history in the collections in Turin, Champollion was guided by many of the principles and historical narratives that Winckelmann had already developed. A North German scholar who had spent the best part of his life in the service of Roman cardinals, Winckelmann was a fervent admirer of Greek sculpture and painting of the 5th century BC, or, at least, how he had imagined the sculpture and painting of that period to have been, for he had never visited the Arcadian landscapes which he so enthusiastically describes in his writings, just as he had never seen any original works of the period he so admired, his observations being based on the evidence of classical literature and Roman copies. Winckelmann's seminal History of the Art of Antiquity, an epitome of 2 decades of study, had first appeared in 1763, and its novel mix of clever scholarship and ardent prose had elevated the traditional European admiration for the classic arts above all others. 5 years later, his murder in Trieste had given the scholar the gloss of a romantic hero, whilst his works had such wide effect on European culture that Goethe declared that age to have been the century of Winckelmann. Naturally, those writings influenced Champollion in a variety of ways. Winckelmann's use of the term art, for example, had transmuted a word long used to describe the skills of craftsmen and musicians into something closer to its modern meaning. For Winckelmann, the fine arts were a highly specific group of artifacts that were defined by the heightened emotional response they prompted in their viewers, a response that he vividly experienced when imagining the sheer beauty of Greek sculpture. This, he considered, was an instinctive response and one common to, or at least latent in, all educated Europeans. Of all the arts, so Winckelmann maintained, Greek figure sculpture was by far the finest, because he had detected in its smooth white forms what he famously described as edel Einfalt und stille Grobe beta e, and noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. Such qualities, he opined, were far more than the products of fine craftsmanship. Classical artists had not copied appearances, but ennobled and transformed reality. Their works, therefore, were embodiments of the ambitions of the society in which they had been made, a society which, as its literature showed, had freely debated issues of morality and liberty and which had sought and discovered the route to human perfection. In short, it was an enlightenment delight. After Winckelmann, therefore, the study of classical literature was no longer viewed as it had mostly been in earlier ages as an adjunct of Bible study and theology, but as a search for abstract moral value and a guide to individual self-perfection. Such was Winckelmann's effect that in the 19th century the disciplines of philology and the critical analysis of classical literature had become a principal component of European education, and that in turn had a profound effect upon the nature and the growth of Egyptology. As Winckelmann described it, classical culture had a tragic history. That, in a subtle stylistic analysis, his history divided into a rakish four-stage progress that is still used today. Within this scheme, the earlier Greek arts had been finer and more elevated than those of imperial Rome because the latter had been created in times of lower morality and less personal freedom. Such moral qualities, Winckelmann believed, could be absorbed directly from his designated works of art as part of the reaction to their beauty, a novel notion that in Champollion's lifetime had prompted a Europe-wide fashion for classical and neoclassical art and for Napoleon's plundering of the fine arts of Europe for public exhibition in the royal palace of the Louvre and the education of the French. Winckelmann's enthusiasm for art's moral value, however, had not extended to the relics of ancient Egypt. He had seen much Egyptian sculpture in Rome but was not greatly moved by it, and his writings had portrayed the pharaonic kingdom as a static and largely lifeless place. Champollion, alternatively, had gazed into the faces of the Turin sculptures and sensed the same noble qualities that Winckelmann had discovered in his Greek arts. These, he now considered, were not images of tyrants but the relics of noble kings and a gallant courtly history. On his arrival at Turin, however, Champollion could not dignify those relics with any kind of written history beyond that held in the writings of the Greeks and Romans. Certainly, the folios of Napoleon's description, along with the Turin collections, offered splendid illustrations for such narratives, yet the names and histories of those handsome monarchs were barely known. Ways and means, the innocence of knowledge. After the museum's sun-filled courtyards and the shaded ground floor, rooms where 100 of Drovetti's finest sculptures had been put upon display, what most interested Champollion at Turin were not the mummies in their coffins, of which the collection had a similar profusion, but the rolls of papyrus. 170 had been listed, most of which Drovetti had brought from ancient Thebes in Upper Egypt. Light and highly portable, considerable quantities of these ancient documents were entering European collections at that time. In fact, it was the greatest harvest of these fragile documents that the world would ever see. Don't buy the ones with pictures, Champollion had written to his elder brother. In Grenoble, their text described funerary rituals. The best papyri, he continued, are those which just have writing on them, for they hold real history. At Turin, the papyrus collection was held within a single room in which the rolls lay side by side on tables. What is remarkable in Champollion's accounts of his first examination of them is how, almost instinctively, he understood the gist of their texts, for they were not written in the formal hieroglyphs employed upon the monuments, but in a calligraphic script, an elegant and convenient abbreviation of the picture signs which the pharaonic scribes had used since the first days of hieroglyphic writing. Following an early Christian bishop, Champollion had christened this cursive writing hieratic. One by one, he took up scrolls that had been rolled up at Thebes by ancient scribes and opened them again in the Turin sunlight, the famous so-called Turin map of gold workings, the satirical papyrus with its images of animals playing flutes and crows on ladders climbing trees and its erotic fantasies which Champollion thought it probably been censored in its own times, but was nonetheless interesting for all that. One papyrus that especially moved Champollion was but a fragment of its original size. Just 3 feet long today, it holds the plan of a tomb. Its lines, as Champollion describes, very thin and nicely traced, with beautiful pale colors, as with a kind of pencil lead. The tomb's design, he notes, is similar to one in the Valley of the Kings that was mapped by the Napoleonic expedition and published in the description to Egypt, that the papyrus plan had a drawing of a sarcophagus at its center, painted in pink granite, and very finely done, further reminded him of a description of a granite sarcophagus which had been taken from the Valley of the Kings some years before and was exhibited at Cambridge, from where an English scholar had sent Champollion a copy of its plan in text. So the papyrus, he decided, held a plan of a royal tomb at Thebes, an identification that, after further study over the following century in some considerable detail by the Egyptologists Sir Alan Gardner and Howard Carter, has proved correct, with considerable clarity in the judicious use of comparisons gleaned from a variety of papers, books and letters. Champollion had initiated the fundamental methods of academic Egyptology, counting kings, the Turin Canon. One evening early in November 1824, as he was finishing his first examination in the room of the papyrus rolls, Champollion learnt of another smaller room within the great palazzo, an abandoned monk's cell on the floor above, where the wreckage of many more papyrus rolls, which had disintegrated during their trip to Europe, were being stored for a final appraisal. This, essentially, the extraction of their occasional illustrations before the broken texts were thrown away. Despite the embarrassed protestations of the museum staff, who were never kind to the foreign scholar, a few days later Champollion entered what he would later call the columbarium of history, for the tiny cell had held a dining table at its center heaped with a dusty mass of papyrus fragments, some of which were so small and light that if the door were opened quickly they would have scattered in the resulting updraft. At first, he wrote, I was seized with a mortal chill, qui talia fondo temperata lacrimis. Virgil's who could ever keep from tears, for here he saw were the remains of several hundred different texts. Then, as I gathered the courage to glance at some of the larger fragments, I recognized that I had in my hand a broken piece dated to the year 24 of Pharaoh Memphis Memnon. Despite his jumbling of a royal name, prescient Champollion had realized that he held in his hand part of an ancient list of pharaohs, an ordered list in which the name of every king had been accompanied by a tally of the years that he had ruled. A chronology of kings, therefore, a skeleton for a history of those unknown ages before the records of the classical historians. So he immediately resolved to examine all the scraps upon that desolate table, and work, though with less speed and gaiety, like the farmers of our country sorting nuts in autumn evenings. That first found piece of papyrus, he later told his brother, had held the fundamental order of the list, and in his usual methodical manner he had started to search for similar fragments amidst the broken documents. Such are the beginnings of a fascination that grew throughout the 19th century, the passion on which the modern academic discipline is founded. 1 week later, on November 15, 1824, Champollion told his brother that he had finished picking out the walnuts, and had been fortunate enough to find a number of other fragments. Only the lower part remains, however, which underlines the original extent of this papyrus and the large amount of historical documentation that it would have held, had barbarians not torn it to shreds. Then, almost as an afterthought, he adds that he had found some royal names written in red ink in the midst of others that were written in black. I assume those were the names of the heads of dynasties. In fact, they marked changes in the location of the pharaoh's residence. The dynasties to which Champollion alludes, alternatively, were the 30 divisions of the kings of Egypt that had been listed by the scholar priest Manetho, who had compiled the history of the pharaohs in the 3rd century BC, even before he had left Paris for Turin, by comparing the surviving fragments of classical descriptions of ancient Egyptian history and a few short lists of hieroglyphic royal names which travelers had copied from the walls of the Egyptian monuments. Champollion had already established an approximate correspondence between some of the hieroglyphic names of kings and those recorded in Manetho's 30 royal dynasties. That list, however, had only covered the latter half of Manetho's history, from the 30th down to the 18th Egyptian dynasty. Now, 100 or so of the larger fragments of the new papyrus in Turin had provided Champollion with a unique register of much earlier kings. A hasty copy of a carefully prepared original, the precious king list, whose fragments Champollion recovered in part restored, had been written on the back of a register of tithes which, it is now generally agreed, had been compiled in Manetho's 19th dynasty of pharaohs, that is, during the 13th century BC. Given that the fragmented roll had originally been around 1 foot 4 inches high and some 5.5 feet long, it could easily have accommodated and listed the names of well over 300 kings, each one followed by the years that they had ruled, and all those kings set in the columns in the order of their reigns and further subdivided into groups of monarchs who had ruled from one location. That sections of the papyrus list closely corresponded to some of the sections of the classical chronology provided by Manetho served to link them and to underline their accuracy. To be clear, Champollion wrote to his brother, though he had previously known but a few of the royal names held in the newfound broken list, Champollion nonetheless considered it to have been a list of real ancient kings. And if that were true, he further understood, then Manetho's history, which described dynasties and ages so lost in human time that it had previously been disbelieved, was in fact a unique account of the succession of a long line of ancient pharaohs. Champollion had glimpsed previously unknown millennia of human history, right back to the beginning of pharaonic history. In its present broken state, the Turin Canon, as the fragmentary papyrus is now known, still raises many questions as to its ancient point and purpose. As Champollion had already observed, given the papyrus considerable antiquity and the similarity of its lists to those compiled almost a millennium later in Manetho's history, both of those ancient records must have drawn upon far older archives that have since been lost. All the other ancient king lists that are known to have survived, moreover, are but partial registers of honored royal ancestors and amid many monarchs, presumably those considered to have been irrelevant or unsuitable for inclusion. Only the fragments of the Turin Canon include virtually all of the known de facto rulers of pharaonic Egypt, including some to whom it does not even award a royal cartouche. And, quite exceptionally, the list had once recorded the number of the years of each ruler's reign. It was, in fact, much like a modern chronology of kings, holding information that, though never a primary concern of ancient chroniclers, was of considerable importance in reconstructing Egypt's ancient history. And still today, despite its damage, the surviving fragments of the Turin Canon hold a unique ancient list of the first 15 centuries of Egypt's pharaohs, and is a primary source of reference for many modern Egyptologists counting time into an unknown past. Champollion's first published accounts of the chronology of Egypt's pharaohs took the form of a series of letters written, on this occasion, to the Duc de Blocas d'Alpes, Premier Gentilhomme de la Chambre du Roi, an antiquarian and archaeologist and one of Champollion's faithful supporters. In comparison with the farrago of opinion and erroneous erudition that characterizes much of the work of his opponents, the modernity of these Lettre is surprising. Champollion sails into the unknown kingdom of the ancient pharaohs with clear-sighted confidence. Perhaps the form of a published letter to a patron meant that, as a courtesy to its intended Readers, he had to use plain language. At all events, short, clear and simply written, Champollions Lettre M. Le Duc de Blacas d'Alpes are in the best traditions of the French Enlightenment, a mixture of elegance and precision. Of course, he frequently misreads the ancient text and employs now outdated ways of spelling ancient names. Namatari, for example, for Nefertari. The wonder, however, is that Champollion had understood those texts at all. And just as he had done in his earlier explanation of the hieroglyphs, so too, in the Lettre M. Le Duc, he sets out in good order, step by step, to construct a chronology for the earlier parts of the history of Egypt's ancient kings, and thus to prove, just as he had previously surmised in his Lettre M. Dacier, that phonetic writing existed in Egypt at a far distant time, and so put paid to Jomard's continued carping about the age of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Champollion prefaces his account with his list of source material. In comparison with what is available today, it is extraordinarily scanty, consisting of the texts that formed a part of Drovetti's Turin collection, some travelers' copies of a few short king lists taken from the standing monuments, the weighty records of the description de l'Egypte, and a handful of other materials from copies of the texts upon the obelisks of Rome, to those odd fragments of antiquity that he and his various correspondents had copied and circulated amongst themselves. Champollion begins his exploration of pharaonic history by proving, just as many would-be decipherers had previously assumed, that cartouches generally held the names of kings and queens. He then observes that many kings had two cartouches that frequently appear in pairs and are distinguished not only by their unchanging order, but also by some specific groups of hieroglyphs that often precede each cartouche. The first of these two cartouches, which Champollion describes as the prénom, English-speaking Egyptologists will later call a prenomen or the throne name. The second, which he calls the nom propre, is usually described in English as the pharaoh's nomen. Unlike the ancient scribes, however, who commonly referred to individual monarchs by their prenomens, Champollion employed the nomen to identify the individual kings, and then, in order to distinguish kings with similar nomens, he set Roman numerals after their translated names. Amenhotep I, II and III, for example, a system that he adopted from that of European royalty, and one that is still used today. At this time too, Champollion was already identifying some of the groups of hieroglyphs that commonly accompany the royal names as titles, and translating them into phrases that were subsequently rendered into English as son of the sun and beloved of the god Amun, the latter having been derived from Champollion's Sherry Damon, though those translated epithets still identify those groups of hieroglyphs today, for the most part, and along with many other common hieroglyphic words and phrases, their ancient purposes and meanings remain ambiguous and largely unexplored. Next, Champollion set out to establish a firm chronology with fixed dates for the pharaohs whose names most frequently appeared in the collection at Turin, those, that is, whose names were engraved upon the beauteous sculptures that Drovetti had mostly brought from ancient Thebes. First, he tackled the relatively plentiful numbers of texts in the collection that were written in so-called Demotic script, a late form of hieroglyphic writing that had originally been used for unofficial purposes, but later, as on such lapidary records as the Rosetta Stone, for formal courtly documents. When dealing with such late period inscriptions, Champollion could occasionally cross-reference his translation of their texts with contemporary classical writings, and so verify not only his decipherment but also his identification of the hieroglyphic names of kings. As he moved further back in time, however, into those ages before Demotic had been used, the historical sources were far more fragmentary. Many of the cartouches on the Turin sculptures named monarchs of Manetho's 18th and 19th royal dynasties names that Greek historians had long since given classical forms, such as Amenhotep, Thutmose, and Ramses, along with typically classical histories. In many of those statues, too, Champollion detected strong physical and even familial resemblances, using Manetho's list and the fragments of the Turin Canon as his guide. He set these royal names and images into a somewhat jumbled order and added up the joint years of their rule as listed in the Turin Canon and the classical sources. Thus he produced a date for the beginning of the dynasties of Amenhotep and Ramses at a point before 1822 BC, a figure that differs from present estimates by just 3 centuries. More important than that single date, however, was that for the first time in modern history Champollion had constructed a roughly continuous chronology of the later dynasties of Egyptian kings, by joining the chronologies of the classical pharaohs of the Greek and Roman periods to some of the older Egyptian dynasties. He had also proved beyond all reasonable doubt, and over and above the continuing objections of the savants, that the hieroglyphs themselves were of considerable antiquity. Though incorrect, Champollion's list of dated kings had also demonstrated that the latter half of Manetho's list of kings, those sections from the 18th to the 30th dynasty of kings, were more than myth. What he could well have added to this leap into the distant past, but did not, was that his data had underlined the veracity of both Manetho's list and of the Turin Canon, and that, in turn, could have provided dates for the earlier dynasties of kings to push pharaonic chronology and history back into the 3rd millennium BC. In the 1820s, however, such a claim, which would have doubled the span of recorded human history, would have been injudicious, for it called into question Europe's traditional guide to early history, the so-called biblical chronology, which clerical scholars had long since divided, like Winckelmann's later division of classical culture, into 4 separate ages, beginning with the creation as described in the book of Genesis, which is called the Adamic Age. This first age is followed by a second initiated by Noah's flood, which in turn is succeeded by a third age which starts with the travels of the prophet Abraham and terminates with the coming of Christ, who ushers in the final, 4th and present epoch. Though many well-known figures of the Enlightenment had long since questioned the validity of this scheme of history, the only people who would publicly discard the biblical chronology for a different scheme of things, for even in the 1820s, there was no firmly established historical data to directly contradict it, were revolutionaries and anti-clericals like Dupuy who were pleased to offer insults to royalty and to the church. But by the 1820s, with Napoleonic laws forbidding insult to the clergy and the subsequent restoration of the monarchy in France, such old-fashioned anti-clericals had to bite their collective tongue. Neither could Champollion afford to alienate his pious patrons. Nonetheless, it was clear to those who were reading the numerous printed papers issuing from Turin that he was engaged in building a chronology for pharaohs far older than any of the Bible's characters. One of his critics, accordingly, claimed that hieroglyphics had been invented by the devil to defend the fiction of Manetho's history. Another simply dubbed Champollion the Antichrist, the Robespierre of Grenoble, hardly bothering to publicly respond to such criticisms or, indeed, to Jomer's continuing jibes. He entered his new-made list of kings, the only one in all the world, into a pocket-book, and in the spring of 1826, he took a tour of the Italian peninsula. Champollion Triumphans. Back in France, the tide was turning for Champollion. Government ministers had realized that with their expenditure of considerable amounts of money on Jomer's recommendation to purchase the now accursed zodiac of Dendere, they had lost the opportunity of acquiring for the Louvre the Turin collection, which as Champollion had demonstrated held previously unknown histories within it and thus considerable national prestige. The savants had had their day. Now, Champollion was commissioned to buy some of the other antiquities that were still flooding out of Egypt. As he visited several of the numerous courts of the Italian principalities, Champollion was surprised to find that news of his decipherment preceded him. At Florence he had met the family of Leopold II, the amiable Duke of Tuscany who was already employing Ippolito Rosellini, a professor of Oriental languages at the Ducal University of Pisa, to teach Champollion's system of decipherment at his court. And so the two scholars had traveled together to Livorno, the Tuscan free port, to inspect the Egyptian cargoes stored in the antiquities merchants' warehouses and buy the best of them for exhibition at the Louvre. At Rome, where to general amazement Champollion had read out aloud for the first time in 2 millennia the inscriptions on the city's Egyptian obelisks, he again found that hieroglyphs are in great honor. And so was he, being persuaded to give short courses on his decipherment to groups of ambassadors and noblemen and even to attend in private audience with the secretary of the Pope. Unlike the court of Tuscany, the invitation had not signaled a papal interest in hieroglyphics, just as Galileo's investigations 2 centuries before, Dupuy unholy theories which challenged the biblical account of history had greatly disturbed the Holy See. Perhaps, Champollion had privately surmised, Egyptian zodiacs had been especially created to give bishops sleepless nights. At Rome, however, he was solemnly informed that his earlier somewhat ill-judged remarks on the correct age of the Dendera zodiac had done the church a beautiful and good service, and that the French ambassador had been asked to canvass his king to grant him an honor for being the savior of the biblical chronology. A son of the Enlightenment, Champollion privately regarded clerics as guardians of superstition, and must surely have been bemused. Nonetheless, in May of that same year, a decree of Labiana made Charles X, the brother of the guillotined King Louis, established a museum of Egyptian antiquities at the Louvre, and Champollion was named as its curator. 2 years on, in November 1828, Champollion and Rosellini were in Egypt, the joint leaders of a Franco-Tuscan expedition. In that interval of time, Rosellini had studied with Champollion at the Louvre as Egyptology's first student, a charming and somewhat self-effacing man. Rosellini was a longtime protégé of the Grand Duke, who had subsidized his traditional theological education at Pisa, and which the young man had taken to the study of biblical languages with such zeal that the Duke had sent him to Bologna to study under the extraordinary polyglot Cardinal Mezzofondi. It was there that he first read Champollion's papers on the decipherment and had been enchanted. Thus these two friends were the first representatives of the mainstreams of Egyptology's subsequent recruitment and research, those who come to the study of ancient Egypt through a fascination with the subject of itself, and those who come to ancient Egypt through their study of the Bible in Egypt and through the good offices of the Duc de Blacas d'Alts. The two Egyptologists, master and pupil, were co-directors of a team of 2 architects and 7 draftsmen. Remarkably enough, although the project had been jointly funded by a Grand Duke and the government of France, the collection of antiquities took second place, its primary purpose being the study of the standing monuments and to investigate in the light of Champollion's decipherment the history, society and religion of pharaonic Egypt. So their joint expedition sailed the length of the lower Nile, making fresh copies of the monuments, images and inscriptions, drawings that would later be published in the manner of Napoleon's description to Egypt, in a series of fine folios. So it was that Champollion finally saw the temple of Dendera for himself. Their boat, he wrote to his brother, had moored late in the evening on the river's bend, and everyone had set out to walk to that fabled monument across moonlit fields. An hour later they had passed through the temple's majestic gateway, and were amazed. The temple, he wrote, is a unity of grace and majesty, a building easy to survey in the manner of the savants, but impossible to describe. For 2 hours we were in ecstasy, running down the great halls with our poor torches, trying to read the external inscriptions in the moonlight. And when they returned at sunrise the next day, what had appeared spectacular in the brightness of the moon was even more so as the rays of the sunlight chiseled out the details. The most ancient part, Champollion observes, is the external wall of the temple's extremity, where the colossal sculptures of Cleopatra and her son Ptolemaeus Caesar are found. The upper bas-reliefs are from the time of Emperor Augustus. His excited yet precise description continues, unabated until the voyagers arrived at the hole in the roof created by the removal of the famous zodiac, and what he found there raised an ironic smile, for the Parisian engineers had left sections of the zodiac's framing inscriptions behind, including the part in which, some 8 years earlier, Champollion had deciphered the word autocrator/emperor from a savant's drawing. In reality, though, at Dendera in the hard Egyptian sunlight, there was but an empty space where that telltale term had appeared within the drawing, a blank cartouche whose interior, as Champollion described it, had never been touched by the tapping of a chisel. The draftsman savant, it appeared, had simply filled it up with hieroglyphs copied from another cartouche. Champollion had been tricked by poor copying. Yet, he continued, my enemy should not begin to crow again, for his examination of the other cartouches in the temple had proved that all its interior decorations, including those of the missing zodiac, were no older than the Roman emperors Trajan and Antonius Pius. And with a last swipe at the savants who had described the temple's reliefs as very ancient and quite beautiful, Champollion observes that though the temple's architecture is, indeed, a masterpiece, its reliefs are hideous. And neither do they decorate a temple dedicated to the goddess Isis, as Jomer's captions in the Napoleonic description state, but to the goddess Hathor as 1001 dedications with which it is powdered clearly tell. This was the meeting of Western Egyptology and the ancient monuments. For the first time in 2 millennia the standing monuments of old Egypt had been put under informed scrutiny, and everything from a reading of their text to Champollion's aesthetic judgment. On his return from Egypt, and despite continued opposition from the usual quarters, a chair was created for Champollion at the Collège de France. Suitably enough, he was the first professor of Egyptian history in the world. In the following year, however, at the age of just 42, he died of a stroke and the chair fell into abeyance. A posthumous likeness shows the man sporting a modest Byronic collar and a white cravat, his dark hair cut short in the Parisian manner, slight of build, sallow and round-faced, with the sharp brown eyes of a southern Frenchman. At the time of his death he had been working on texts gathered on his Egyptian journey, material that both Rosellini and Champollion's devoted brother, along with several other scholars, would continue to publish in the course of the following half-century, as the man himself took on the legendary role of scientific hero. 6. Aftermath. 3 kingdoms, the Chevalier Bunsen. One man, especially, had been intrigued by the sight of Champollion striding white-stockinged round the streets of Rome, pausing only to scribble down the hieroglyphic text engraved upon the city's Egyptian obelisks. Baron Christian Karl Dacier von Bunsen, a learned and most pious Protestant and secretary to the Prussian ambassador at Rome, had read the papers on the decipherment and written excitedly to his ambassador, the great classical scholar Carsten Niebuhr, what is your opinion of the précis du système hieroglyphique by Champollion? I have a kind of shrinking from it, because the knowledge of Coptic is probably indispensable to its comprehension, and the system of signs would seem arbitrary and far-fetched. Despite his preliminary misgivings, the Baron was completely hooked, and so began a study that engrossed him for the remainder of his life, a labor that in 1844 resulted in a 5-volume work entitled Egypt's Place in Universal History. Bunsen writes in the preface, writing before Darwin, yet in the spirit of the age, Bunsen had sensed that an underlying evolution, a set of processes, had guided the progress of the human race since the days of its beginnings, and to discover what those primary principles had been, His 5 volumes attempted to fit the writings of ancient Greece and Rome, of India and China, of Russia, Japan and Tibet, and Champollion's new chronology of ancient Egypt into the 4 ages of the biblical chronology: Adamic, post-diluvial, Abrahamic, and the final, Christian era. The notion that recent human history is not a product of human intellect and endeavor but part of a natural evolution of race, ethnicity, and language is now properly regarded as a relic of Western 19th century thought, and a dangerous one at that. Along with those of others of his time, some of Bunsen's theories are innocent precursors of the calamities of 20th century Europe. The main protagonists of his universal history, for example, or groups of languages that he and many other scholars of the time had transformed into imaginary tribes and nations, amongst which were the Aryans, whose history he traces from the Himalayas to Winckelmann's idealized ancient Greece, and from there to modern Germany, and the Semites, who were widely considered to have been the Aryans' historic foil and the antecedents of European Jewry. Nonetheless, Bunsen's eccentric volumes have had a fundamental impact upon Egyptology. However faulty his racial theories, the Baron had detected in the surviving record of ancient Egypt a pattern that encouraged him to divide Champollion's lengthy chronology of kings into 3 separate ages, which he labeled the Old, Middle, and New Empires, following the replacement of the term empire, a relic from the days when French had been the scholarly language of Europe. These are the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms that are still used today. Such generalities have advantages and disadvantages. For the most part, Bunsen's scheme had followed the dynastic divisions of Manetho, and has found broad archaeological confirmation on the ground. The New Kingdom, notably, still runs from Dynasty 18 to Dynasty 20. Bunsen's Middle Kingdom, however, which was limited to Manetho's 12th dynasty, has subsequently been expanded to encompass not 1 but 2.5 of Manetho's dynasties, that is, from mid-Dynasty 11 to the end of Dynasty 13, and to contain 2 different seats of government, Thebes and Memphis. Thus this modern Middle Kingdom departs both from Bunsen's definition and from the fundamental structure of the Turin Canon, which is based upon the location of the seat of government. What Bunsen had clearly seen, however, was that many of Manetho's 30 dynasties were little more than literary devices, several of them, for example, are symmetrically divided into groups of 9 rulers each. And his 7th dynasty consists of 70 kings of Memphis who ruled for 70 days. The construction of such picaresque dynasties, Bunsen considered, had massed times when court record-keeping had failed. Disordered periods, therefore, in times of invasion even, just as the Greek and Roman historians briefly describe. Naturally enough, most traditional historians have directed the best part of their studies to the periods of Bunsen's 3 great kingdoms the well-documented periods represented by mighty monuments and famous rulers, and have tended to describe the confusions of the intervening periods as times of governmental collapse. In the 1920s, however, as further evidence began to come to light, the 2 vague periods between Bunsen's 3 well-studied kingdoms were awarded the titles of the first and second intermediate periods, and in the 1960s, the equally fragmented period between the ending of Bunsen's new kingdom in the 6th century BC, a period with which Champollion had many chronological difficulties, was awarded the title of the third intermediate period. Nowadays, as further evidence accumulates, livelier histories have been discerned for Pharaoh's Egypt and those contained within the 3 mighty kingdoms of the Baron Bunsen. Just as Champollion well knew from personal experience, so as a young man he had been personally involved in the fiery contemporary politics of France. Periods in which civic order is disturbed are often times in which the government and culture of the state is scrutinized and redefined. And so, today, the histories of the centuries that divide the Baron's kingdoms offer fascinating and vivid alternatives to the popular versions of ancient Egypt as a thrice-recurring monolithic power. Denkmäler, Professor Lepsius. That Bunsen's tripartite scheme was taken up so quickly and has lasted for so long was due to two main factors. First was the fact that ambiguities and omissions in both Manetho's history and the Turin Canon allowed no absolute agreement upon the dates that the first pharaohs had ruled, or even those of the reigns and monuments of some of the most celebrated pharaohs. So Bunsen's terminology handily defined common areas of historical interest without the necessity to continually engage in ongoing debates about the accuracy of various alternative chronologies. The second reason for its swift adoption was that Bunsen's scheme was taken up by Professor Richard Lepsius of Berlin University, a one-time protege of Bunsen. Lepsius was the originator and editor of another series of folios illustrating the Egyptian monuments, a publication which, on this occasion, contained the records of a Prussian expedition to the Nile during the winter of 1842-5, which Lepsius himself directed, subsidized by the Berlin government in seine Majestät dem Könige von Preußen Friedrich Wilhelm IV, Lepsius' great volumes, Denkmäler aus Ägypten und Ethiopian, Berlin, 1849-59, exceeded the physical size and weight of both the Napoleonic and the Franco-Tuscan publications, and its drawings were of a far higher level of accuracy. To this day, the Denkmäler are some of the world's largest printed books. In their own time, they were the apotheosis of an intense half-century of study by bands of adventurous and eccentric European scholar-travelers who were copying directly from the monuments so as to satisfy, as Sir Alan Gardner put it, an urgent need for more material and better copies. Most of these scholars' marvelous folios of original drawings, however, had not been reproduced. Only after the publication of the lithographs and steel plate engravings of Lepsius' Denkmäler in 1859 could the best part of the inscriptions on the standing monuments of Egypt be studied and translated in the libraries of Europe. For the first time, also, the Denkmäler provided a detailed account of the inscriptions of ancient Memphis, especially those in the cemeteries of Giza and Saqqara, which Champollion and Rosellini had largely circumvented during their Egyptian expedition, in order, it would appear, not to compromise the biblical chronology which the family of the Dukes of Tuscany firmly upheld. Now, though, Lepsius' splendid folios reproduce drawings of King Khufu's name as it appears in graffiti within the Great Pyramid's interior. Genuine contemporary evidence that the prodigious monument had been built for that most ancient king who, though listed both in the Turin Canon and in Manetho's fourth dynasty of monarchs, had previously been but little documented outside the tales of ancient Greek and Roman travelers, along with dozens of architectural plans of paintings and reliefs in tomb chapels of similar age. Lepsius listed all those monuments as memorials of the Altes Reich Bunsen's Old Kingdom, this, as opposed to the later monuments that his expedition also measured up and drew, which were labeled as having been made in the times of the Neues Reich or the New Kingdom. Thus, Bunsen's terms have lasted till today. Lepsius had first met Bunsen in the 1830s, when he was studying exotic languages in Paris, which at that time was the European Center for Linguistics. A few years later, Bunsen invited the young man to serve as his secretary in the offices of the nascent Prussian Archaeological Institute at Rome. Doubtless Lepsius' considerable linguistic abilities would have been of great help to the Baron in the compilation of his Universal History. At the same time, and on Bunsen's recommendation, Lepsius had taken up the study of hieroglyphs with Rosellini, who was teaching Champollion's system of decipherment at the University of Pisa. As Lepsius later told his biographer, by that time he had wanted to become the German Champollion. It was an astute ambition. Following Champollion's death in 1832, lawsuits and a clamor of bitter gossip had broken out around his papers. and there had been a brief lull in the study of hieroglyphic. Then in 1837 Lepsius used a posthumous publication of Champollion's Egyptian grammar as the basis of a scholarly re-examination of the various criticisms and theories which yet surrounded the decipherment, and published his results in his Lettre am. Le Professeur Rosellini, sur l'alphabet hieroglyphique. This essay forcefully confirmed the fundamental accuracy of Champollion's system whilst at the same time making some corrections to it, for neither the Frenchman nor his Italian friend had seen that most of the hieroglyphs which they had assumed to have been single alphabetic letters, signs, that is, denoting uniliteral consonants had actually represented entire syllables of sound, that is, sounds that were multiliteral. After Lepsius' Lettre, all but a handful of eccentrics had accepted that Champollion's system of translation was the only sound tool for the further study of hieroglyphic, and for the first time work undertaken by a small number of English, French and German enthusiasts, lawyers, preachers, school inspectors, wine merchants and museum curators started to come to grips with the grammar of the hieroglyphs and to translate entire sentences and texts. Like Champollion before him, Lepsius also constructed a chronology of Egypt's ancient kings, based as ever on classical and a few Egyptian texts, and augmented by his own discoveries in Egypt. It refined all earlier versions and remains the basis of modern chronologies of Egypt's pharaohs to this day. Yet for a century and more considerable differences remain between the absolute dates attributed to many dynasties and kings, various schools of Egyptologists employing one of two separate versions, one German and one ancient Egyptian, as an embattled contemporary described them. Nowadays, the combined products of 2 centuries of epigraphy and excavation plus carbon-14 measurement and other techniques of scientific dating have produced a broad chronological agreement and thus have provided relatively fixed dates for Bunsen's kingdoms in the better part of Manetho's dynasties. Now, it seems, that Bunsen's old kingdom had lasted some 450 years and finished with the ending of Manetho's 6th dynasty of pharaohs at around 2200 BC, and that the Middle Kingdom of more modern histories had started after an interval of 200 years and finished some 3.5 centuries later, at around 1650 BC. It is often said that Lepsius' Lettre am. Le Professeur Rosellini was the final act in the decipherment of hieroglyphic. With the aid of Bunsen and other luminaries of the Prussian court, the same publication had also to Lepsius commissioned to head the state expedition to Egypt, from which he did, indeed, return as the German Champollion, compiling the main volumes of the Denkmäler, holding the first chair in Egyptology at Berlin University and being appointed as director of the Egyptian collections in that city's great museums, as a privy councillor, as a keeper of the royal library and as an advisor to the establishment of Prussian, later German, archaeological institutes in several foreign lands. In those same decades, between the 1840s and the 1880s, the term Egyptology and the profession of Egyptologist were both born. Champollion had laid the foundations of all that. By an active imagination, by confronting earlier visions of a long-lost age with the order and rationality of his time, he had created the basis of the now traditional European image of ancient Egypt. The legacy, Champollion's Ancient Egypt. From a survey of his surviving papers, it appears that Champollion had considered the lives of Pharaoh and his courtiers to have been similar to those of the rulers of the Ottoman Empire, with whose Egyptian viceroy, Muhammad Ali Pasha, he had enjoyed a lively correspondence whilst traveling throughout that province. Fortunately for Egyptology, this vision of the ancient East was closer to that of Mozart than that of Verdi. So Champollion's ancient Egyptians are not draped in heavy velvets nor even the neoclassical togas that decorate the images of temple priests in the description of Egypt's reconstructions of ancient life. Champollion's Orient, alternatively, is delightfully rococo, The abduction from the Seraglio, after all, had been commissioned by an uncle of Rosellini's patron, the Duke of Tuscany. This was a world in which the primary divisions in human society were not those of ethnicity or nationhood, but those that naturally exist between various grades of nobility and an underlying peasantry. So a group portrait of the Franco-Tuscan expedition at their work in Egypt shows most of the expedition's members wearing the silk and cotton robes of middle-ranking Ottoman officials, the ranks they also held at European courts after the expeditions of Champollion and Lepsius. However, after the 1860s, as Western attitudes to non-Western cultures shifted and the word Egyptologist came into use, traveling scholars wore European clothes. Before those silk-clad adventurers had begun their work, the greatest source of information upon ancient Egypt had been the writings of the classical historians. And naturally, when Champollion started to establish his chronology of ancient Egypt, he too had used Manetho's king list as his general guide and employed the Hellenistic historians' device of subdividing the great long list of monarchs into 30 separate dynasties. Now, dynasty is a term widely used in classical literature and also in translations of the Bible. In its earliest manifestations, in the works of Hesiod and Homer, the term denotes a group of able men, and though in later centuries it gathered connotations of lordship and domination, only in Roman times did it attain its modern meaning of a familial succession of kings or princes. So unsurprisingly, and like so many other terms in the common Egyptological vocabulary, dynasty has no equivalent in the hieroglyphic dictionary. In Champollion's day, however, when European culture and education was saturated in classical imagery, dynasties of kings were a familiar fact of schoolroom histories. So, naturally enough, in following decades, as more lengthy hieroglyphic texts were translated, the history of ancient Egypt was assumed to have consisted of a succession of ruling families, an assumption which is a part of the same easy vision which assumes that the pharaohs had ruled quasi-European courts in the manner of Shakespeare's Cleopatra. Yet it is far from proven that the ancient pharaohs had ruled in the manner of those later dynasties of kings or, indeed, that they had obeyed the same rules of succession or, certainly, that they had held the ominous notion of the bloodline, either in the sense of sangre azul of Castilian aristocrats or the Germanic notion of Blut und Boden, that would order the dynasties of the European kingdoms in disorder so many of their subjects. Nonetheless, the attitudes of Champollion and his successors to the ancient Egypt they were engaged in building was greatly bolstered by the fact that they enjoyed personal and practical familiarity with many aspects of that most ancient culture. For though Europe has no deserts and no Nile, Champollion and Ramses both lived in small-scale wheat-based economies founded on the technologies of the Middle Eastern Bronze Age. Broadly speaking, the material elements of those two economies, stone cutting and metal smelting, animal husbandry and farming, and the everyday technologies of house and home, weaving, potting, baking, brewing, cheese making and the rest, were much the same. So, as a man of his own time, as a French bourgeois from a small, well-watered farming community in central southern France, when Champollion viewed images of Ramses in his battle chariot, he shared the ancient charioteers' eye for horses and had a practical understanding of their harnesses and tackle, just as the pretty images of so-called scenes of daily life that decorate the walls of many a pharaonic tomb chapel were also common scenes in Champollion's day. He walked in stables and over threshing floors like those of Pharaoh. He too lived in houses with hierarchies of servants working at many of the same tasks as those undertaken in the households pictured in the monuments of Pharaoh's courtiers. And Champollion also lived within the orbit of the courts and governments of Europe as a kind of courtier. His life's work, indeed, depended upon their patronage, and he had circumscribed his personal beliefs to sustain that patronage. so it is not surprising that Champollion and his successors had assumed that ancient Egyptian society had a similar composition to traditional Western European society, that it too had consisted of peasants, landowning aristocrats, soldiers, sailors and the clergy, and that, in turn, led to the use of such terms as king and prince, peasant, soldier and priest, which, though there is scant contemporary evidence for such structures, gives the easy impression of early European governmental institutions. Yet even as Champollion and his successors were employing such terms to describe the elements of pharaonic society, the traditional way of life that they imply was coming to its end. The various revolutions that had accompanied the demise of feudalism and the rise of the industrial state served to redefine most aspects of European society down to the very names of the months of the year. And at the same time, terms like nation, art, economy and slave were undergoing their modern reinvention. Today, of course, the traditional structures of the pharaonic state described by the early Egyptologists are found only in the world of children's books and historical reconstructions. That, indeed, is the reason why the traditional image of ancient Egypt seems so familiar. Though loaded with more modern terminologies, at root its traditional vocabulary reaches deep within the European past and casts the ancient world as its exotic mirror image. Should new and different words, therefore, be substituted for traditional terms such as king, courtier and priest? Would they be less contaminated by alien worlds and thus provide less weighted visions of that lost society, replace noble, say, with a sector of an elite? Experience, however, shows that the trick of replacing one jargon with another from a different discipline serves to implant yet another set of alien concepts into the unique pharaonic enterprise. Better than to nod to Egyptology's own history and to translate and describe the ancient relics in a selective handful of the old familiar terms, but with the understanding that they carry 2 centuries of European baggage and that a king in the pharaonic context is an archaic chess piece extracted from a game whose rules are scarcely known and hardly understood and whose relics, therefore, hold yet untold possibilities. Though Hardjedef is called a prince today, he was not a prince of Denmark nor of Wales. For Hardjedef was not a European prince in life. At Pharaoh's court need not have been a hotbed of dynastic struggle or political ambition. If, alternatively, this pharaonic prince is seen by virtue of his tomb and titles to have been a favored member of King Khufu's household, then the friction of the mismatch between the ancient and modern meaning of the word may help to stimulate alternative visions of how that ancient, so-called court had functioned. Neither should it be assumed, however familiar Ramses' sculpted battle horses may appear, that images of fighting pharaohs represent a quasi-European monarch leading a national army to protect or extend the boundaries of a nation-state. The sense of space and state and nationhood held within the ancient populations of the region of the Lower Nile was quite different from that of 19th century Europeans. Rather than possessing boundaries defined by cartographic dotted lines, the pharaonic state was conceived from the center out, that is, from the brick walls of the royal residence, Depera, which is also the origin of the word pharaoh rather than from the ill-defined extremities which in various locations and at different phases in pharaonic history appear to traditional historians to indicate the edges of an empire. Nor are such constricted reinterpretations limited to the spheres of geography and politics. As the curator of several grand collections, one of Champollion's first tasks had been to bring order and identity to the innumerable images of gods they held, for which he made a prettily illustrated catalogue, Le Panthéon Égyptien, in which the attributes and iconographies of ancient gods are pictured and described as if they were the attributes of Christian saints, pinned onto their pages like butterflies. In boxes, Champollion's Egyptian gods are presented, sui generis, in the same manner in which Champollion had quietly viewed religions of his own time, as a mass of signs and superstition, his explanatory commentaries outlining the classical myths in which the pharaonic deities appear. This was an attitude to faith from the age in which Guido famously described Christianity as a mishmash of fallacy and violence, and it denied the ancient culture of the Lower Nile all sense of piety and purpose and, indeed, its own particular intelligence. Ironically enough, the same view would be commonly held by many Christian Egyptologists of later generations who came to ancient Egypt through their study of the Bible and held their faith to be the only true religion. To this extent, Jomard's misgivings about Champollion were well founded, for he had replaced the traditional European image of ancient Egypt as a culture of unfathomable wisdom, which is an inherently respectful attitude, with one that reduced the profound metaphors of the pharaonic scribes and craftsmen, their symbolism as Champollion's successors call it, with what W.H. Auden would describe as false and boring allegory. And when such explanations fail, as fail they must, the ancient mysteries are explained away as products of Oriental inscrutability or archaic primitivism. Nonetheless, Champollion's work laid the foundations of a framework by which a previously unintelligible heap of relics and ruins of unknown age has been transformed into the memorials of a millennial ancient culture. This framework, though, is not of itself pharaonic. Not the contents of the library, but its shelves, its press marks and its catalogs, in short, the alien apparatus that has set that surviving mass of millennial pharaonic relics into an order that modern people may readily understand. So though the system is frequently presented as an authentic outline of ancient sensibility and history along the valley of the Lower Nile, it certainly is not. There is a wealth of ancient life, good news yet to hear, and fine things to be seen, beyond the confines of that library. How then, to begin? A particular advantage of this history is that it opens in the times of Hardjedef and the Giza kings, in an age that, despite all the scholars' catalogues, chronologies and plans, traditional historians still consider to be largely enigmatic, as mysterious, indeed, as the great stone sphinx that crouches on the Giza plateau beside those three colossal pyramids. Here, then, we face a choice. Either to adopt the historians' traditional assumptions about the nature of all nations and primitive and oriental government and construct another history of that lost society based upon those limited parameters, or to start again, to gratefully accept the data that Champollion and his successors have so patiently collected and, thus equipped, walk out again onto the Giza plateau, wondering the while what on earth it was those ancient people had imagined they were doing.